Hi, this is Zibby Owens, and you're listening to the award-winning podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. I'm also the host of Moms Don't Have Time to Lose Weight, and I'm the editor of the anthology, which you should run out and buy, called Moms Don't Have Time to, a Quarantine Anthology. All proceeds of that book go to COVID-19 vaccine research. And I'm the editor-in-chief of Moms Don't Have Time to Write, a new publication on Medium, and we're accepting submissions, so please send your personal essays there. And if all that isn't enough, you can follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens, and my website is zibbyowens.com. Okay, now back to this amazing podcast. Ruth Ozeki is the author of The Book of Form and Emptiness. She's a novelist, filmmaker, and Zen Buddhist priest. She's the award-winning author of 3 novels, including My Year of Meats, All Over Creation, and A Tale for the Time Being, which was a finalist for the 2013 Booker Prize. Her nonfiction work includes a memoir, The Face, A Time Code, and the documentary film Having the Bones. She is affiliated with the Everyday Zen Foundation and teaches creative writing at Smith College, where she is a Grace Jarko Ross 1933 Professor of Humanities. Welcome, Ruth. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss the Book of Form and Emptiness.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
What a powerful, amazing read this was. Oh my gosh. Like, so cool on so many different levels, like so meta. It was awesome.
Thank you.
Will you tell listeners what your book is about, and then I'll dive into my written questions.
Sure. Yes. Well, it tells the story of a young boy named Benny O. And when Benny is 12 years old, his father dies in a, tragic and really kind of avoidable and stupid automobile accident. He's actually run over by a truck. And Benny witnesses this. He witnesses his father's death and is, really quite traumatized by it. And during the funeral, he hears his father's voice calling his name. All right. And then subsequently, for about the year afterwards, he occasionally hears his dad's voice. But the story really picks up after that, when he starts to hear not just his father's voice, but he starts to hear the voices of things in his house, objects, speaking not necessarily to him, but, expressing themselves. And these are sort of random objects. I mean, like a sneaker or a pencil or a Christmas ornament or, a piece of wilted lettuce in the refrigerator. And sometimes he doesn't understand what they're saying, but he understands a kind of feeling tone that the objects, seem to have. And so needless to say, this is troublesome to him. And particularly when the voices follow him out of the house and, all the way to school. And he ends up getting in trouble at school because of this. He gets sent to a school nurse who then refers him to a child psychologist. And so he's diagnosed with a mental illness and is medicated. So this starts a whole story about the way that children's mental illnesses are treated. Benny, in any case, decides on his own that school is no longer an option. And so he runs away to the local public library and meets a whole cast of characters there who in various ways help him. One of them is a homeless Slovenian poet-philosopher named the Bottle Man. And another is a young, beautiful performance artist who he falls in love with, of course. Another character is the character of the book itself, his book, right? And his book starts to talk to him and starts to tell his life story. So the narrator of the Book of Form and Emptiness is the Book of Form and Emptiness. And I think that's probably what you meant when you talked about a kind of meta. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. That's exactly what I meant.
So these characters kind of help Benny find his own voice ultimately and, learn to live with all of the voices that he hears.
Well, I wanted to read 2 passages from when the importance of books and why the book is actually talking and all of that, which I found so fascinating and just so neat to be the reader then, right? Because now all of a sudden the reader is a character in the book as well.
Exactly. And that was the fun part of writing this, because of course a book is also a talking thing. A book is a talking object, right? And so if you're reading a book, you are listening to an object speak to you. So yes, exactly. The reader becomes a character and sort of is brought into the world of the book.
Yeah, which was so neat and so original, which I just love. Let's see, which one? Let me read this part. Well, this is just the first words of a book are of utmost importance. The moment of encounter when a reader turns to that first page and reads those opening words, it's like locking eyes or touching someone's hand for the first time, and we feel it too. Books don't have eyes or hands, it's true, but when a book and a reader are meant for each other, both of them know it, and this is what happened when Annabelle opened Tidy Magic. When she read the first sentence, a shiver ran down both their spines. That is awesome. I love that so
it's
much.
Nice that books have spines, right?
Yeah. Right? That was just so good. And then I thought there was something else. Oh, has it ever occurred to you that books have feelings too? As you listen to this romantic tale of two ill-fated lovers, do you ever stop to wonder about what it feels like for us? Because in truth, if skin marks the border where an I ends and a you begins, then in these moments of impassioned boundary crossing called love, we envy you. It's that simple. We envy you your bodies. How can we not? Books have bodies too, but ours lack the organs needed to experience the world. The skin that covers our boards and encloses our words is different from yours. Our skin, whether made from paper or parchment or cloth, or these days some combination of plastic, glass, and metal, fulfills a similar function of marking our perimeters. But even the most haptic and capacitive of our skins cannot experience pleasure the way yours can. We cannot feel the ecstasy, the merging of self and other. This is it's just the coolest. Aww. What made you think about it in this way? And I spend a lot of time thinking about books, so I think this is why this is so interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know if have you read Elephant and Piggy, these children's books?
I haven't, no.
Okay, this is such a random thing, but there's one called We Are in a Book, right? And the characters are like, we're in a book? Like, wait, the book ends? And, and they're like, we're on page 87. Oh, no, now we're on page 92. It's going too fast. So it's like you're aware of it. Anyway,
I love that. Yes, exactly. No, and I think anybody who reads books and loves books knows that feeling of being in a book so thoroughly and completely that, and you with a physical book, you're turning the pages and you're getting closer to the end. And there's that feeling of panic, do I read faster or do I slow down? So that kind of boundary crossing is something I think that all readers understand, that what happens when you fall into you just fall into the, in my case, the fictional world, of a book. Do you remember a children's book called Harold and the Purple Crayon?
Oh my gosh, I read that all the time. Yeah. Not as much anymore, but that was my fourth kid's one of his favorite books. But
and that's what it reminded me too when I was writing this book. The idea that Harold is literally drawing his world as he's living, as he walks into it, as he steps into it. And that's what's happening with this book too. The book is telling the story as we are, and readers are experiencing it, right? So it's this idea of the book telling Benny's story and telling itself into being, but also telling Benny into being as well. So, you have to ask the question then, which comes first, the book or the boy, right? Who's telling whom, right? And so that's, I just playing little games like that amuses me when I'm writing. And so I think, but I think that my inspiration comes from, I think exactly books that I read in childhood, because children's books are filled with animated things, right? I mean, objects are always speaking in children's books, they're always behaving and doing things, right? And so the sort of world of animated objects was something that, it's part of the magic of childhood. And I wanted to try to capture that in a kind of an adult format in this book.
Well, it's true. I mean, who's to say that that's so crazy, right? I mean, all of a sudden it becomes crazy. I feel like one of the conclusions, and maybe I misread, but I felt like one of the conclusions was well, this is just a part of Benny's life. This doesn't necessarily have to be so terrible. He can learn to live with it, and it's okay, and it's interesting, and it's just one part of him, and it doesn't mean he has to be at a societal outcast.
Exactly. And if there's one thing that I was really hoping in this, and you read it exactly the way I'd hoped, this idea of really expanding what we consider normal to be, right? And I think that the idea of normal is a social construct, right? And it's completely dependent on, on the culture that we happen to live in, right? So if we live in a culture where, voice hearing is considered to be, a symptom of, of a psychosis, then, that's the way we're going to think of it. But it doesn't necessarily have to be. And in fact, there are far more people who hear voices than is popularly reported, and hear voices without any problem at all. In fact, Joan of Arc, her voices were divine, and were her guides in life, and even the fathers of the so-called fathers of psychology, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, also reported hearing voices, right? So the idea that hearing voices signals some kind of abnormality, I think is a problem, and so in Benny's case, certainly, he just needed to learn how to negotiate and navigate, the voices that he hears. And I think too, as an artist, as a writer, I hear voices all the time, right? I mean, that's where books come from. That's where characters come from. And in fact, the idea for the book kind of came to me after a reading. I was at a public library in Michigan, I think it was, and I was talking to the audience about how characters come to me as voices, right? It's like I hear, not outside my body, but I kind of hear in my mind the voice of a character speaking to me. And then I, sort of write it down and I listen, and I follow that voice where it leads me, right? And afterwards, during the Q&A, a man raised his hand and asked me, when you talk about hearing voices, are you talking about, hearing the voices outside you, or, is this more a kind of an internal process? And I explained, and he told me that at that point that his son heard voices as though they were outside his head, right? And his son found this to be very distressing, which I think, sometimes happens as well. And so anyway, that really got me thinking about the sort of spectrum, I think, that exists between creativity and what we call creativity and what we call madness, right? And so there's this, I think it's a spectrum, and, it's interesting, I think, to look at it that way.
Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, there's obviously the two dovetail in so many instances, yes, exactly. Right? It's hard to, I mean, in all arts, not just literature, right? Like artists and the pervasive sort of myth of, right, the stereotype of the crazy ad.
That's right.
Anyway.
That's right. No, absolutely. I think that's really important too, to recognize. I mean, one of the things I'm grateful for is that I live in a culture that prizes fiction. That actually looks at fiction as something that is valuable rather than a pathology, right? And I could imagine living in a culture where making things up that aren't real could be looked at as a pathological condition that needs to be, cured or locked up or, but thank goodness we live in a society where making things up is looked at as a positive thing. And, I actually get paid to do it too. So isn't that wonderful? Lucky me.
I mean, yes. But you're right. It's the circumstances where it's okay are very clearly delineated. Yeah. And I don't really write fiction. I like to write nonfiction and essays and, first person stuff, but I did experiment with writing fiction a few times. And I did find, and I felt like I was sounding crazy about it because I had this long flight where I was writing, and my husband, we didn't even talk because I was like, I can't, I'm so in this, and then I was explaining it to him when I got off the flight and telling him what happened. He's like, well, what's going to happen next? And I was like, I don't know what they're going to do. I don't even know. I'm so excited to see. And he's like, what are you talking about? I don't know. It sort of has taken on a life of its own.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. I hate to break it to you, but it sounds to me like you're a fiction writer. So you might want to explore that or not, but you really are sounding an awful lot like a fiction writer right now. No, that's exactly the experience, is that, I don't know where, the stories are going to go. I'm just writing into, kind of into the void and just following the story, where it goes and hoping that it'll take me someplace. So it's kind of like an act of faith too,
Mm-hmm. A long time ago, I interviewed somebody, and I took this almost offensively because I asked sort of about where her ideas came from. And she said something like, well, that's just such a bad question because, where do like dreams come from? They just come. And I was like, all right, well, sorry. I don't know. I'd done like 2 podcasts or something.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know. I was just wondering, was there anything?
I think it's a great question. It's a question I ask myself all the time. I'm always asking myself, where are these ideas coming from? It's true. And I think they do come from, I think they are like dreams. I think they come from the unconscious. And so really the way to access them is to sort of, tap into the unconscious, relax the controlling editorial mind and let the unconscious, the kind of playful part of the mind have control, have free reign, right? And I think in a way, we started by talking about, children's books and animation. I think it's the part of our mind that we lose as we get older, that playful part that makes stuff up. That's not afraid of the unknown, that, everything's unknown when you're a child, right? So you just kind of stumble forward into it and keep your eyes open and, hope that it's just what you see is wonderful.
And so was part of this some sort of referendum on medication for kids?
Well, it's something that, that I think a lot about. When I was a child, when I was 14, I was struggling with mental health issues myself. And I was diagnosed and medicated. And that really sort of shaped my life for a while. And this was many, many years ago. And psychopharmaceuticals were sort of blunt instruments back then, and I think that, I don't have an opinion about medication. I think it can be absolutely, very, very helpful, to many people. So it's not like I'm anti-pharmaceutical at all. But I think that, to think that that's the only way, right, of treating what sort of different psychic states, right? Psychic states that we look at as being outside of the norm, right? It shows a certain kind of lack of imagination. And there's so many wonderful programs now that are really, treating, psychological challenges in different ways. There's a book that I've been reading now for a while called The Body Keeps the Score.
You're like the 5th person who's told me about this book in the last week. I have to go buy this book.
It's amazing. I read it, I started reading it in 2007 when it came out, and I wasn't really able to kind of get into it. But, I think that to be honest, I think the pandemic and just everything that's happening in the world has created a kind of social trauma that has made this book very, very relevant. And in fact, it's right up there on the New York Times bestseller list again, like
I saw that. Yeah.
Like many years after its publication. Right. And Bessel van der Kolk, the writer, talks about some wonderful, therapies that, would be considered, alternative in the sense that they are not psychopharmaceutical. But he has very strong opinions about psychiatric diagnoses. And they are, he's very, very critical of that. So I think I'm kind of influenced by him right at this point too. But it's a wonderful book. It's a really wonderful book. Yeah.
All right. It's on my list. When I have time. What is the book you're working on now?
Oh, I just have started it. So, I'm a little bit loath to talk about it, but it's another, let me just say that it's another kind of intergenerational book about a grandmother and her granddaughter and, who are sort of thrown together during the lockdown, right? And I think that it might be called something like Conversations We Will Never Have. But I'm not sure. It's still early.
Okay. You reserve the right to change.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
I always change my mind.
I won't hold you to it.
I always change my mind a million times.
Do you have any advice for aspiring authors?
Wow. Well, I would make the distinction between an author and a writer, first of all. You can't be an author until you're a writer, right? So my first advice is to aspire to write. Right. And, I really do think that the author is very different than the writer. The author's job is to go out and represent the book. But the writer's job is to literally pull the book out of nothingness. and put it onto the page, right? And that's as you have described so beautifully, it's a compelling and exciting, but also a little bit frightening thing. So, if that frightens you, then, I think the trick then is to figure out ways to get over that fear, to work with that fear and to turn that fear into energy of some kind. And people have so many different strategies for doing that. Some friends of mine always write in groups, just because, it's sort of like bicycle racing, you can kind of draft along with, along with the other writers, and it holds you accountable. And I think that's one of the hardest things for aspiring writers is being held accountable and feeling like, that somebody's waiting and somebody's waiting for your words and, they really want to read them. So I would also suggest, a writer's group of some kind, it can be anything, but just somebody who, you trade pages with and talk about the process. That I think is really helpful. And then the other thing I do is, because sometimes it's hard to find that person, I keep a process journal. And my process journal is like my imaginary friend, and the process journal is unfailingly patient with me, is interested in everything that I think, all my ideas, very interested in those, always asks me questions about what it is that I'm writing. So when the journal asks me questions, and of course I answer, right? And just the process of answering the questions, right, helps me sort of move along. I can complain to my process journal. I can brag, I can boast, and the journal is never, critical of me. Right. And so this is, it's sort of a relationship that I've developed, and I've done this, I've been keeping a process journal since I think the mid 90s. Right. So, we have a long friendship at this point.
Perhaps it's become this book, right? It's like
I know. That's right. Exactly.
All right. Wow. Well, Ruth, thank you so much. This was so fun. And, I really, really enjoyed this book and the innovation and creativity and wherever the voices led you. And for this reader, at least, was very enjoyable and thought-provoking. So
wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Zibby. And I look forward to reading your novel at some point too.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. You too.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.